Wolves attack two lonely bear cubs, and then the unthinkable happens. The forest was alive with the sounds of early morning, chirping birds, the distant rustling of leaves, and the faint murmur of a flowing stream. The towering pines stretched toward the sky, their tips kissed by the first golden rays of the sun. Despite the beauty of the wilderness, an eerie stillness hung in the air, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. A rugged 52-year-old wildlife conservationist moved carefully along a narrow dirt trail, the weight of his camera pressing against his chest. His grizzled beard and weathered face bore the marks of years spent in these woods, studying and protecting its inhabitants. His name wasn't known to many, he preferred it that way. Solitude suited him, but he had an unshakable duty to the creatures who called this place home. Pausing at the edge of a clearing, he adjusted the strap of his backpack and took in the scene before him. Something felt off. The birds had gone silent. Tension hung in the air, coiling around him like an unseen force. His instincts sharpened, something was happening deep within the forest, something he wasn't prepared for. The stillness in the forest was unnatural. The usual hum of the wild, chirping birds, rustling leaves, had vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The 52-year-old conservationist instinctively slowed his steps, his fingers tightening around his camera strap. His years in the wilderness had taught him that when nature fell quiet, something was terribly wrong. Then a sound shattered the silence, a high-pitched yelp, a roar, and a desperate cry echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bird or a deer. It was something bigger. Something in distress. His pulse quickened. The cry came again, this time more frantic. Without hesitation, he adjusted his backpack and broke into a swift walk, navigating through the underbrush with trained precision. His boots crushed damp leaves as he moved deeper into the dense forest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew better than to rush into an unknown situation, but something about that cry gnawed at his soul. Then, through the thick foliage, he saw them. In a small clearing just ahead, two tiny bear cubs, no older than a few months, were backed against a fallen log, their trembling bodies pressed close together. Their golden-brown fur was fluffed up, making them look even smaller than they were. Their wide, frightened eyes darted between the trees, ears twitching at every sound. And then he saw why they were so terrified. A pack of 5 wolves had encircled them. Their lean bodies were tense, eyes locked onto their prey. The largest of the pack, an alpha male with thick gray fur and piercing yellow eyes, stood at the front, his lips curled back in a silent snarl. The cubs let out another pitiful cry, one of them pawing at the log as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The conservationist's breath hitched. His mind raced through the possibilities. Cubs this young should never be alone. Where was their mother? Had she been killed? Was she injured? He scanned the area, but there was no sign of her. The only thing standing between these cubs and certain death was fate or him. One of the wolves took a cautious step forward, head lowered, body poised to strike. The cubs whimpered, pressing even closer together, their tiny claws digging into the bark of the fallen log. But they were powerless against what was coming. The conservationist knew he was witnessing a brutal moment of nature. Wolves had to eat. They were hunters, and these cubs were vulnerable, easy prey. If he intervened, he would be disrupting the balance of the wild, something he had sworn never to do. But how could he just stand there? His grip tightened on his camera. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, anything. But what? His mind warred with itself. This was the law of nature. The wolves weren't being cruel. They were surviving. And yet, another step. The lead wolf was close now, its sharp fangs bared, saliva dripping from its mouth. The older cub let out a sudden, desperate growl, tiny, but filled with the kind of bravery only the helpless could summon. It lunged forward, a pathetic attempt to fight. The wolf barely flinched. It was toying with them now, letting them feel the fear before the inevitable. A deep, primal anger surged through the conservationist. He had spent years photographing nature, documenting the wild, telling himself that he was just an observer. But this wasn't something he could just watch. He had to act. But how? His rifle was slung across his back, but he wouldn't use it. He wouldn't kill. His heart raced as he calculated his next move. He needed to create a distraction. Without wasting another second, he yanked his flare gun from his belt, cocked it, and fired it straight into the air. A loud bang exploded through the trees, followed by a brilliant flash of red light. The wolves startled. Their heads snapped upward, ears flattened against their skulls as the bright flare illuminated the clearing. The pack hesitated, just for a second. But that was all he needed. "Get out of here," he roared, stepping into the open. He swung his arms wide, making himself look bigger, his voice booming through the trees. The wolves, spooked by the sudden explosion and movement, growled in irritation but backed away. They weren't cowards, but they weren't foolish either. The alpha's yellow eyes locked onto him, filled with caution and challenge. For a brief moment, the conservationist and the alpha stared at each other, two forces of nature standing off. Then, with a reluctant snarl, the alpha turned. One by one, the wolves retreated into the trees, their forms vanishing into the shadows like ghosts. Silence. The only sound left was the rapid breathing of the cubs, their tiny bodies still trembling from the near-death encounter. The conservationist let out a shaky breath, his pulse still thundering. His hands trembled slightly from the rush of adrenaline. He had done it. He had saved them. But now came the real question. What was he supposed to do with two orphaned bear cubs? The wild was still dangerous. If their mother was gone, they wouldn't survive long on their own. He had broken the rules of nature once already. Was he willing to do it again? As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over yet. The silence in the clearing felt heavy, almost suffocating. The two tiny bear cubs remained huddled together near the fallen log, their small bodies still trembling from the terrifying encounter. Their golden-brown fur was ruffled, their dark eyes darting around, searching for something, someone who wasn't there. Their mother. The 52-year-old conservationist stood frozen, watching them. His chest was still rising and falling rapidly from the adrenaline rush of scaring off the wolves. But now, a new weight settled on him. What now? He had done what no wildlife observer should ever do: intervened. He had disrupted the natural cycle, stepped between predator and prey. And now, these cubs were his responsibility. He ran a hand over his face, his rugged fingers brushing against his grizzled beard. His instincts told him that walking away was the right thing to do. Nature had its ways. Maybe the cub's mother would return. Maybe they would survive on their own. But deep down, he knew the truth. They wouldn't make it without their mother. They had no protection. No way to find food. If the wolves didn't come back, starvation, exposure, or another predator would finish the job. He inhaled deeply, looking at the cubs again. One of them, slightly larger than the other, lifted its tiny head and let out a weak, helpless whimper. Its small body trembled, its little ears twitching as if trying to listen for its mother's return. But no one was coming. The conservationist clenched his jaw. He had a choice to make. If he took them in, it meant breaking every rule of wildlife conservation. These cubs were not pets. He wasn't supposed to interfere beyond observation. And yet, how could he turn his back on them now? His mind raced with possibilities. If he left them, he'd be sentencing them to death. If he took them in, he'd be risking his safety and theirs. Bears, even cubs, were unpredictable. A deep sigh escaped him. There was only one real option. He had to take them. Gritting his teeth, he adjusted his backpack and took a careful step forward. The cubs flinched, pressing themselves closer to the log, their tiny bodies instinctively shrinking away from him. Their mother had probably taught them to fear humans, smart. But right now, they needed him. He crouched down, keeping his movements slow, and spoke softly. "Hey there, little ones. I know you're scared." The smaller cub let out a soft, frightened squeak, its tiny paws pressing into the dirt. "I won't hurt you, I promise," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as if speaking to a wounded animal, which, in a way, he was. They weren't just physically vulnerable, they were emotionally shattered. The larger cub, braver than its sibling, lifted its head slightly, sniffing the air. The conservationist carefully reached into his pack and pulled out a granola bar. It wasn't bear food, but at this point, it was something. He unwrapped it, broke off a small piece, and gently placed it on the ground between them. The cubs stared at him, hesitant. For a moment, he thought they wouldn't take it, but then, slowly, the larger cub stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of food. A few more seconds passed, then, with a swift movement, it grabbed the piece and chewed quickly. Relief washed over him. They were hungry. That was good, it meant they still had the will to survive. The second cub, seeing its sibling eat, hesitated, then reached out with its tiny paw and grabbed its own piece. The conservationist let out a slow breath. This was progress. But now came the hard part. He had to carry them out of here. Carefully, he removed his thick field jacket and laid it on the ground. He needed something to wrap them in, to make them feel secure. Then, moving as slowly as possible, he extended his hands. The moment he touched the larger cub, it let out a sharp, terrified squeal. The smaller cub followed with a panicked cry, their tiny bodies squirming against him. Instantly, his heart clenched. He knew they were frightened. They were vulnerable, alone, and now being scooped up by a massive, unfamiliar creature. "They think I'm taking them away from their mother." His grip remained firm but gentle. He had no choice. If they ran, they wouldn't last the night. He wrapped the jacket carefully around their small bodies, ensuring they were warm and secure, then lifted them against his chest. They squirmed at first, but the warmth of the fabric seemed to calm them. Their tiny claws clung to the folds of the jacket, their frightened whimpers slowly fading. He adjusted his hold and took a deep breath. Time to go. With one last glance at the clearing, he turned and began the trek back toward his cabin. The dense forest stretched endlessly ahead as the 52-year-old conservationist carried the two fragile bear cubs, their tiny bodies wrapped in his thick jacket, their warmth pressed against his chest, their breaths uneven but steady. The once frantic cubs had calmed, exhausted from their ordeal. For the first time since encountering them, it seemed like things might be okay. But the wild had other plans. A low, rumbling growl froze him in place. His body tensed instantly, his boots skidding slightly on the damp earth. The sound had come from behind him, deep, guttural, and unmistakably close. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned his head slowly, instinct screaming at him not to make sudden movements. And then, from the thick shadows of the trees, two glowing eyes appeared. A wolf. No, not just any wolf. The alpha. The same gray-furred, sharp-eyed beast from before had returned. But this time, it was alone. And it wasn't leaving. The realization hit him hard. The pack hadn't given up. They had backed off, yes, but the alpha had doubled back, following him through the trees. And now, it was watching. Waiting. The cubs, as if sensing the change in the air, began to stir. The larger one let out a tiny, nervous whimper. The smaller one burrowed deeper into his jacket, pressing itself against him. The conservationist knew what was happening. The alpha had unfinished business. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about the hunt. The wolf had been denied its prey, and now it had tracked them through the forest, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A chill ran down his spine. His mind raced through his options. Running? Impossible. The cubs were too weak, and carrying them slowed him down. Fighting? That was a last resort. He had a hunting knife and a rifle, but he didn't want to kill the wolf unless absolutely necessary. The wolf took one slow step forward, its massive paws barely making a sound, its yellow eyes locked onto the cubs in his arms, hunger burning deep within them. The conservationist gritted his teeth. Not this time. He took a deliberate step backward, keeping his grip firm on the cubs. The wolf's ears twitched at the movement, but it didn't lunge. Not yet. It's testing me. He reached for his flare gun, the same one he had used earlier, but before he could pull it out, the wolf suddenly tensed. Then, it lifted its nose and sniffed the air. The conservationist's breath caught. It wasn't looking at him anymore. It was smelling something. Then, without warning, the wolf's entire body language changed. Its ears pinned back. Its fur bristled. And for the first time, it looked uncertain. That's when the smell hit him too. A pungent, musky odor. Rotting meat mixed with something sickly sweet. His stomach twisted. That wasn't normal. Something else was nearby. Something bigger. Before he could even react, a loud snap echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under something heavy. The wolf immediately whipped around, ears flattened, body poised to flee. A second snap. Closer. The conservationist's pulse skyrocketed. Then, a low, guttural growl shook the air. Not from the wolf. From something deeper in the forest. The wolf let out a sharp snarl, backing up several steps. It wasn't afraid of him. It was afraid of whatever was coming. A third snap. And then, silence. Even the wind had stopped. The conservationist didn't move. His body screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to remain still. Whatever was out there, it was watching. The wolf let out one last low growl, its yellow eyes flicking between the man and the unseen presence in the woods. Then, without another sound, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The conservationist didn't relax. If the alpha wolf, one of the fiercest predators in the wild, had chosen to leave, then whatever was out there was something worse. His grip on the cubs tightened. And then, he heard it. A sound that sent an icy chill down his spine. Deep, labored breathing. Slow. Heavy. Close. The conservationist's mind raced. There was only one thing big enough to make a wolf back down like that. A grizzly bear. But if it was a bear, then why hadn't it charged? The cub suddenly whimpered, curling into his chest. And just like that, he knew. It wasn't just any bear. It was their mother. The forest held its breath. The conservationist stood frozen, his heart pounding as the deep, labored breathing grew louder. The musky scent in the air was unmistakable now, bear. Not just any bear, their mother. The two cubs whimpered softly, burrowing deeper into his jacket, their small bodies trembling. The conservationist tightened his grip, his mind racing. Had she been following them this whole time? Was she injured, or was she about to attack? Then, through the thick underbrush, a massive figure emerged, a grizzly bear, towering even in its weakened state. Her thick brown fur was matted with dirt and streaked with blood. A fresh wound ran along her shoulder, likely from an earlier fight. Her dark eyes locked onto him, filled with a mix of exhaustion and something else, something primal. Her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air, and then her gaze flicked to the bundle in his arms, the cubs. The conservationist swallowed hard. He had survived wolves. He had carried these cubs through the wilderness. But now, he was standing between a mother and her young, and that was the most dangerous place to be. Slowly, very slowly, he crouched down, his hands shaking as he loosened the jacket. The cubs whimpered again, hesitant to move. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling sound, not a roar, not a growl, but a noise that vibrated deep in his chest. A call. The larger cub moved first, cautiously wriggling free from the jacket and stepping forward on shaky legs. The mother bear didn't move. She just watched, waiting. Then, the second cub followed, its tiny paws pressing against the damp earth as it let out a small, pitiful cry. That changed everything. The mother rushed forward. The conservationist's muscles tensed, but she wasn't coming for him. She scooped both cubs into her massive embrace, nuzzling them desperately, sniffing them all over as if making sure they were real. The cubs clung to her fur, letting out tiny whimpers of relief, their small bodies pressing into her warmth. The conservationist felt his chest tighten at the sight. Against all odds, they had found their way back to each other. But then, the moment changed. The mother bear's massive head lifted, and her dark eyes locked onto him again. For a terrifying second, he thought, this is it. He had touched her cubs. He had interfered. When was she going to attack? But then something incredible happened. Instead of anger, her expression softened. Her breathing steadied. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she dipped her head. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in the wild, gestures spoke louder than words. She was acknowledging him. Not as a threat. Not as an enemy. But as something else. His throat felt tight. He had spent his whole life studying wildlife, believing himself to be an observer, an outsider looking in. But at this moment, he was part of it. The mother bear let out one last deep breath. Then, with her cubs tucked against her, she turned and disappeared into the trees. The conservationist didn't move. He just stood there, watching as the forest swallowed them whole. And then, for the first time in what felt like hours, he exhaled. His body was exhausted. His hands shook. But his soul, it felt lighter. As he made his way back through the forest, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had set out that morning as a witness to nature. He had planned to take pictures, to document, to observe from afar. But nature had pulled him in. And in doing so, it had changed him. Some stories weren't meant to be told through a lens. Some stories, like this one, were meant to be felt deep in the heart where words failed. As he stepped onto the porch of his cabin, he paused, turning to glance once more at the endless stretch of wilderness behind him. Somewhere out there, a mother and her cubs were safe. And that was enough. With a quiet smile, he stepped inside, leaving behind nothing but footprints in the wild. If this incredible story of survival and compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful wildlife rescue stories. Every video brings you closer to the untamed beauty of nature, highlighting real moments of struggle, bravery, and the deep connections between humans and animals. By subscribing, liking, and sharing, you help us continue bringing these inspiring stories to life. Your engagement allows us to spread awareness about the challenges wildlife faces and the importance of conservation efforts. Our channel is dedicated to showcasing authentic and heartwarming moments, stories that remind us of the raw, untamed spirit of nature and the silent bonds we share with the wild. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible rescue story. Together, we can create a world where every animal story is heard and appreciated.